Right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Einstein Forum online event. My name is Misha Gabovich. I'm a senior researcher at the Einstein Forum, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to another event in our ongoing Solidarity in Danger series, which the Einstein Forum organizes jointly with the Research Committee 47, Social Classes and Social Movements of the International Sociological Association. And I'm extremely pleased to welcome as our speaker tonight, Greg Yudin, professor of political philosophy at the Moscow School of Social and Economic Sciences. Welcome to the Einstein Forum, Greg.
Hello.
Before I introduce him very briefly, just one technical remark. Everyone is very welcome whenever they want to start typing their questions or comments into the Q&A box that you can all see at the bottom of your screen. We ask you not to use the chat function, which is very distracting because everything you type there is visible immediately to everyone. So please use Q&A instead. And then at the end of the talk, I will read out your questions and comments, and Greg will be able to answer them. So Greg Yudin is a political philosopher, of course, a historian of political thought, but he is also well known in Russia and beyond as a sociologist. And I would venture to say that he is probably one of the most important public intellectuals in Russia today, which is visible among many other things in the fact that whenever he writes anything online, be it an article or even a social media post, that tends to get commented and shared by thousands, if not tens of thousands of people. And he writes regularly on issues such as democracy, voting, protest, public opinion polling, and every time his contributions generate intense debate. So he's going to talk to us tonight about democracy and plebiscites, in fact, the transition from democracy to plebiscites, and he will explain why voting has come to dominate our democratic imagination. So welcome again to the Einstein Forum, and the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Misha. Thanks for having me at the Einstein Forum. It's a pleasure for me to be with you. Of course, I would have preferred to be in Berlin, in Potsdam physically, but since that's not possible, we have at least this opportunity to discuss democracy, because I'm actually doing theory of democracy. I'm doing political theory, and more specifically theory of democracy. And in the domain of the theory of democracy, I'm researching the plebiscitarian democracy and perhaps even more specifically public opinion polling. So what I'd like to do today is to share with you some thoughts on what actually is plebiscitarian democracy and how does it reshape our understanding of democratic government. Well, I guess I have to start the presentation. I'm not sure, just not sure I can do that.
The green button at the bottom of your
screen. I'm pressing the green button, but I'm not sure I can share the presentation.
I think you're authorized to.
Yeah, I am, but somehow I don't see my options here. I don't know why. Oh, okay. No, that's not what I need. Sorry, I don't know what was happening. So you don't see the presentation at that point?
We can see that you're sharing a screen, but it's blank right now.
It's blank.
It's white, and
that's actually the first time I encounter this kind of trouble.
Would you like to email it to me and in the meantime start talking?
Perhaps yeah, that's the right way to do that. Just let me let me compose a message. Yep, just a moment.
The good thing is,
yes, you have it at your Gmail address. So yeah, I would be really grateful for you to you for sharing, if you can see that. Anyway, I will start at this point without the presentation. I was just going to show you a couple of images. Hopefully there will be an opportunity to do so. Well, some of them come from my home country, from Russia, where we have a real rise of the so-called e-democracy, electronic democracy, or digital democracy. We have a lot of opportunities, a lot of new opportunities and new technologies used to enhance our opportunities to vote. And some of them include the apps that you can download on your smartphone, using your smartphone to participate in the decision making, or so at least you're told. You can participate in decision making in the city of Moscow. At this point, I think more than 4.5 million Muscovites, they have this application downloaded and using it from time to time to answer the questions sent by the Moscow city government. And the whole program is called Active Citizen. And it pretends to enhance the opportunity of political participation. This is even called sometimes direct democracy. That's not all, because now we also have a wonderful opportunity of voting online. And I guess Russia has rapidly become one of the countries with probably even the largest numbers of online voters. We had this experiment for 2 years already, in 2019 in Moscow, and then in 2020 during the plebiscite on constitutional amendments, on which I will talk a little bit later. So during this plebiscite, there was an opportunity in 2 big cities, in Moscow and Nizhny Novgorod, to vote online. That drew 1.2 million voters in 2020, and in this year parliamentary elections there will be obviously more. So Russia becomes one of the global leaders in terms of online voting. And of course, now that, oh yeah, thank you so much. That's what I wanted to do. Can you please show the next slide? Yeah, that's actually the app that I was mentioning, the Active Citizen. Yeah, and then next there will be, yeah, and that's the way you vote online in Russia. And now with this pandemic, of course, and with all the mess during the U.S. election, of course, many people in the U.S. are saying, well, why wouldn't we do this simple thing as they do in Russia? Why wouldn't we just start online voting? So that is meant to just to demonstrate that the opportunities for digital democracy are rapidly growing. And that reflects, to a certain extent, the tendencies in the domain of democracy itself. The next slide, please. The next slide. Yeah. Okay. Because it is now, of course, common knowledge that there is a crisis of representative democracy reflected in low levels of political engagement, in high abstention, in general disenchantment with representatives, and general distrust for politicians. And while there is a lot of discussion on how should we face it, I think one of the most influential solutions to that is to face it through direct democracy, replacing the representative democracy with direct democracy. And then, yeah, you have this very simple idea, which is promoted by politicians all over the world. Why not simply having a poll? Why having all those representatives that we don't really trust? Why having all those technicalities? If we pretend it to be a democracy, why not asking the people? Now we have a lot of technical opportunities to do that immediately. And yeah, next, please. You have just several examples. Of course, you have the famous five-star movement in Italy that was inspired by this kind of direct democratic imagination. And then next, you have the president of Ukraine, who used to be, of course, an actor, servant of the people, serious, and whose electoral platform started with the promise to hold more referenda. Didn't really deliver, but anyway, that was a thing that probably brought him to his office. And then next, yet another example is the Indignados movement in Spain that also meant to reform democracy in a more direct democratic way. And all of them, they probably not that close in terms of ideology. Actually, all of them are to a certain extent post-ideological. Zelensky, for instance, pretends to be one day libertarian, another day Democrat, yet another day liberal. You have this strange left-right bloc in Italy, and you have a somewhat left-leaning movement in Spain. But generally, what they are trying to do is to overcome the existing ideological divisions with this idea of direct democracy. Next, please. Now the question is, if the idea is correct, if the idea that voting is the same as democracy is correct. Well, one thing I'd like to draw your attention to is that there is a rapid development of technologies for gauging public opinion and popular will in countries that are usually believed to have some issues with democracy, like Hungary, Russia, Turkey also, although Turkey is a little bit different. In these countries, you have a whole set of very interesting institutions introduced pretty recently, from national consultations by mail, that's a Hungarian case, to plebiscites, to e-voting, as already mentioned, to those voting apps. And what is particularly interesting about Russia is the use of the public opinion polling, which are regularly released and actually dominate the political discourse, because that's the only thing that matters, the poll numbers of the president. And that, of course, to a certain extent, the situation in many liberal democracies, where the electoral campaigns are dominated by opinion polling. But in Russia, that is specifically important. The political discourse is centered around the so-called ratings, the polling numbers. And there is also a huge progress in sampling in Russia. One of the most interesting examples was the so-called Crimea mega poll, which was actually a substitution for a plebiscite, because Crimea, Russian Federation conducted a huge opinion poll in all Russian regions, representative sampling in all regions, designed just in 3 days, so almost momentarily, and that was one of the record-breaking samples for these kind of opinion polls. Next, please. Then, of course, we might ask if these things, if voting and elections are actually key indicators of democracy, so why those seemingly, probably, non-democratic regimes, many people would say that they are actually not really democratic. Why are they so eager to embrace elections and voting? There's a theory, of course, that elections is something they keep just as a window dressing, just not to irritate their neighbors too much, to pretend they are democracies, and otherwise they would be happy to eliminate it. But we see the opposite. What we see is the opposite. What we see is that they are embracing and enhancing voting. So actually, the voting is built into the political mechanics of this kind of regime. So why does that happen? Next, please. We have to ask, of course, how did we get here? How did we get to this identification between democracy and voting elections? Actually, in political theory, it is common knowledge that elections are not a democratic institution. We know that from Aristotle onwards, that elections are an oligarchic or perhaps an aristocratic institution. It depends on how you evaluate this type of rule. While democracy prefers certitude. And there are two reasons for that. Well, first of all, it's obviously that during the election, you are selecting the best, and that is by definition aristocracy. But what is perhaps even more interesting is that the election is a procedure organized always by political elites. So to a certain extent, whoever holds the election, whoever organizes the election, is almost doomed to win this election. Of course, you can have a change of elites there, but the elites who are organizing the election, they also control the election in the vast majority of the cases. And that's also true for plebiscites. We'll get back to this. Next, please. The question then is what kind of transformation, this expansion of elections and voting, what kind of transformation does it bring to democracy, given these undemocratic origins of voting and elections? Next, please. In the early noughties, I guess there was a lot of concern among the political scientists who were seeing the rise in democracies adopting the institutions of liberal democracies and focusing mainly on the elections. There was a lot of talk about the perils of electoralism. The idea, of course, was that you shouldn't focus so much on elections because there are many other important things in democracy. But this wording failed to work. So for some reason, those newly emerging liberal democracies, they failed to take this into account. And even more, we can see that this idea that democracy equals elections is now also widespread among the well-established liberal democracies. So why did it happen? Next, please. And then why is that our democratic imagination, why is it that our way of thinking of democracy is so often paralyzed by elections and voting? If you go right to the street and ask a random person what democracy is, there's a very high chance that this person will answer, well, that's about elections, about having free and fair elections. So why did it happen, given the non-democratic origins of elections? Yeah, next, please. And to answer this question, we have to go back to those origins, to those historical origins of this process that I call the electoralization of liberal democracy. So basically, the liberal democracy means subdued to elections and voting, to electoral procedures. Next, please. And if we dig deeper, we have to start with Napoleon III, who ruled, of course, France from 1848 to 1870, and who, to a certain extent, inherited the mechanism from his uncle, whom he adored, of course, that the new type of regime should be an alliance between the sovereign ruler and the masses, who are united against aristocracy and clergy. So basically, you have this alliance between the person on the top and the bottom, and they're united to attack the middle. Next, please. Well, there were certain preconditions for the rise of Napoleon III, among which we have to pay attention to the radical extension of franchise of suffrage in 1848, after many years of very limited suffrage. In 1848, right after the revolution, the French had a radical extension of suffrage. It was basically universal male suffrage in 1848, and that was what brought Napoleon to power. He was nobody expected him to win the election because the Republicans were the main contenders, but there was the write-in election. And people just came to the polling stations and wrote the name they liked, and the name they liked, they cherished, was the name Napoleon Bonaparte. And Napoleon III himself Louis Bonaparte was himself a strong advocate of universal suffrage, and later he actually went into a fight with his own parliament to restore the universal suffrage in 1850 and 1851, just right before he conducted a coup and transformed the Second Republic into an empire. And yet another cause for the rise of Bonapartist rule, of Bonapartist regime, was, of course, the resentment after historical defeat. And that was something pointed out by a thinker, a philosopher called Auguste Romieux, who was probably the first to tell that there is the new era of Caesars, that this rise of Bonapartism ushers in the new era of Caesars. There was a book called the Ère des Césars, and one of the reasons for this rise of the new Caesar was, of course, this resentment widespread among the French after the historical defeat in Waterloo. So calling a Bonapartist ruler was a way for the French to heal this historical trauma. Next, please. And that was again an empire as a combination of two principles which seem to be contradictory, perhaps, the principles of monarchy and popular sovereignty. Bonaparte himself actually was a theorist of this kind of rule, and he had a book where he said that this is a unity of democratic equality and hierarchical order. So basically things that might seem contradictory to each other, but there was a synthesis of these two very different principles. Next, please. He, of course, won this election of 1848 and then held several plebiscites, where he also was an obvious winner, mostly because he dominated the agenda. He was the one who declared the plebiscite, who summoned the people to the plebiscite, who chose the wording of the questions, And that was a very beautiful solution, because it turned out that when a ruler invites people to the plebiscite, basically the people reacts to the question as sees the question as a fait accompli. There's nothing to decide. It's just the role of the people is just to validate the ready-made decision. Next, please. You have a real ballot from one of those plebiscites on the right here. One interesting thing is that not only did he hold those plebiscites during his rule, but also there was a system of local elections, of regular local elections, which were producing legitimacy for his officials. And the whole administrative apparatus was really focused on mobilizing the support for the candidate, for the Bonapartist candidate, and the candidates were putting much effort into trying to get his endorsement, get mentioned by the emperor. So there was a whole system of electoral procedures of voting, penetrating the French Empire under Napoleon III. Next, please. Well, next important episode of Bonapartism has to do with Germany, of course, during the years of the Weimar Republic. Next, please. And during the Bonapartist period, or rather immediately after the Bonapartist period, the Germans were rather cautious about this type of rule. It was something really odd for the 19th century Europe. But some of them were quick to realize that might be a working model. So already Wilhelm Roscher, one of the leaders of the German historical science in 19th century, called the Caesarism two-faced Janus. Meaning that there are masses striving for equality on the one hand, and the absolute monarch on the other hand. And that is kind of synthesis of these two principles. Next, please. So in Weimar Republic, right after the Great War, we have rather similar preconditions for this kind of regime. We also have the introduction, the rapid introduction of universal suffrage when Germany becomes a republic, ceases to be Reich. And then, of course, the major military defeat. Next, please. And then we have a first full-scale theory of plebiscitarian democracy produced by Max Weber in his late years, right after the war. So Weber believed that mass democracy is absolutely inevitable, but also very dangerous, and that it has to be limited. Basically, he was trying to save the idea of the responsible rule under new conditions of mass democracy. He didn't really believe in parliamentary democracy. Looking at the German parliament, what he was seeing were just factions of aristocracy trying to hijack the agenda and manipulating the parliament in their own self-interest. So he was looking for a way to create a responsible leadership in Germany. And that's why he suggested this idea of plebiscitarian democracy, of democracy headed by a president, a popularly elected president, a president who would have a strong democratic legitimacy that would enable him to trump the parliament and put a hold on the ongoing political crisis, if necessary. And he was quite frank about that plebiscitarian democracy is democracy only by name. What he used this metaphor of dictator from the electoral battlefield. meaning, of course, that Caesarite leaders were usually the dictators from the real battlefield, and now you have the dictator from the electoral battlefield now with this universal suffrage. He, of course, took inspiration from the regime of Napoleon III, but also from the United States, which he interestingly considered to be almost a case of plebiscitary democracy, where Americans elect a king with almost unlimited power, a king who dominates the system through the electoral machines. And what is important here is that Weber envisioned this type of regime as a synthetic regime. So not a middle point between monarchy and democracy, but a synthetic regime. It would be robust enough to combine the elements of both regimes. It's not a middle ground, not a middle point, but a synthesis of two ideas to create a strong and robust rule. And of course, Weber had no idea of democratization as being a process of moving from monarchy to democracy. He was quite open about that, saying that democratization doesn't mean the increasing power of the masses, of the people. So for him, the democratization should have ended with this plebiscitarian regime. Next, please. Just a few features of this plebiscitarian design. Next. According to Weber and some of his followers. So first of all, there is, once again, this is a synthetic regime. It has a combined legitimacy. On the one hand, you have a leader, a strong leader, a charismatic leader. So this is in Weber's terms, a charismatic legitimacy. He called it a non-authoritarian charismatic legitimacy, but that doesn't really matter at this point. And so on one hand, you have this leader elected directly by the people. On the other hand, you have the legal rational legitimacy, which is invested into parliament and bureaucracy. This is a combination of the two. So a strong leader heading a bureaucratic apparatus and towering over the parliament. Next, please. So this idea of strong leader was the thing that Weber took effort to insert into the Weimar Constitution. And there's a lot of discussion on how much he contributed to the Articles of 41 and of course, the infamous Article 48 of the Weimar Constitution that granted the leader with the extraordinary powers. That's perhaps not something I should talk too much about in this audience. And one of his followers was Carl Schmitt, who also endorsed plebiscitary democracy and also as a synthesis, but now meaning more openly a synthesis of democracy and monarchy. For Schmitt, the plebiscitarian democracy was the way to unite those two opposing principles, democracy and monarchy. Next, please. Of course, under plebiscitary democracy, we have a strong domination of the executive power because all the magistrates, all the bodies are strictly subordinated to the president, particularly in the crisis moment where he has to put a hold and stop the crisis, prevent the strife. Next, please. What is perhaps most interesting here is that both Weber and Schmitt are quite clear about the way elections operate under plebiscitarian regime. Elections function as an acclamation, meaning that the voters are not supposed to choose among the options or to select. They are rather presented with a ready-made decision, and they are meant to acclaim to this decision. So this is basically a vote of confidence, and the participants understand that as a vote of confidence. Of course, the settings for the plebiscite, the most important things such as timing, wording, rules, and list of candidates, if we're talking about elections, for instance, they are determined by the leader himself. So he himself is the one who produces the agenda. Of course, the outcome is predetermined, and both of them are again very clear about that. This acclamation, it requires the supermajority. So it has to be supported, it has to be acclaimed to by the whole people, or by vast numerical majority. It is interesting because the idea of plebiscitarianism is based on the distrust to the people, on the distrust towards democracy. So how do you combine that? This distrust and the requirement for the people to acclaim almost unanimously? Well, the idea is that you have the people staying passive almost all the time, and then emerging just for the moment of the acclamation. And the supermajority is produced by drawing part of the population to the polling stations, and since this part of the population is the part that shows up, then it becomes the denominator, of course, and then you have the supermajority among those who show up. So basically, you can have a very low turnout under this regime, and it is fine for it, at least to a certain extent, to produce this supermajority, to produce this popular legitimacy. Yeah, next, please. So people basically remains passive, but emerges to acclaim leader. I call it the snapshot people, because the only way to see these people is just to create a snapshot, the snapshot of the popular will. There is, however, one difference between Schmidt and Weber, because Weber was totally for the passive people, whereas Schmidt was more eager to draw like real energy from the people, and in that way he was closer to the totalitarian disfigurations of this kind of regime, whereas for Weber it was just an authoritarian rule. Yeah, so how do we proceed from plebiscitarianism to our current understandings of what democracy is? And that's an interesting story. Next, please. Because the definition of democracy that we often use today, and this is closest to identifying the democracy with the elections, with the voting, it of course comes from Joseph Schumpeter, from his 1942 book published in the US, where he endorses this idea of minimal democracy, emphasizing that the democratic method is not about the people ruling, but about the elites ruling, about the individuals ruling, and the people voting, and thereby creating some competition between the elites. So basically, the people are left with only one choice: either they accept or refuse those who rule, either they accept or refuse their decisions that do not rule, of course. Next, please. And this idea, this very influential doctrine of minimal democracy, was to a large extent shaped by those German ideas, interwar German ideas of plebiscitarian democracy, because Schumpeter was shared with both Weber and Schmidt the despise for the idea of the real popular rule. He called it the classic doctrine, and mocked it basically in his work. He also believed that the popular will is always manufactured. It doesn't really exist. You have to manufacture that. That's how politics works. He also endorsed a strong leader, interestingly mentioning Napoleon here as a responsible, strong leader who was able to deliver. And also sees election rather as an acclamation, as an acceptance of leadership, and that's basically it for Schumpeter. And of course, he was influential precisely because he pointed to the criterion, to the distinction between democracy and non-democracy. The democracy for Schumpeter is not some mysterious popular rule, but rather a regime where you have the elections, where you have the vote. If you don't have the vote, it's not a democracy. Next, please. And this distinction was actually turned out to be really, really influential in the following tradition of political science, particularly in comparative political science, because many theorists who shaped this tradition, they actually accepted this definition, using elections as a key element of democracy. And you can see it in many of those indices of democracy we use to create the ratings of the countries, to differentiate between democracies and non-democracies. So what we have here is an interesting latent influence of the plebiscitarian doctrine that it has over the currently dominant understandings of what democracy is. Of course, Schumpeter didn't mention Weber and Schmidt in his 1942 book in the US, because that was, of course, during the war. The war started by a regime that was brought about through this plebiscitarian Weimar Republic with the extraordinary powers of the leader. So Schumpeter didn't mention them, but he, of course, was influenced by them. And then he, in turn, shaped the understanding of what democracy is in comparative political science. So that now that when we think of what is the difference between democracy and non-democracy, we, to a certain extent, owe it to those plebiscitarian theories. Yeah, next, please. I think I'm now at the point where I can ask if these plebiscitarian underpinnings of the present-day democracies, if they can turn into a new type of institutional arrangement. I've already mentioned that there is this growing crisis of representation that makes us look for democratic alternatives, that makes us think of how can we redeem our democracy. Next, please. And the outcome of that is this electoralization of democracies. The effect being that elections are now believed to be the key instrument of democracy. I think the recent election in the US was very interesting, because both sides were, what they were sharing is the belief and the insistence on the fact that we have to protect elections because elections is our democracy. Well, they have, of course, different understandings of how we should protect them, but they are united in the idea that democracy is about elections. Next, please. From the point of view of the theory of democracy, we are also witnessing a lot of troubling phenomena, like weakening civil associations, like a fragmentation of a public sphere where discussions are restricted to those so-called echo chambers. So we have the increase in atomization. That also creates the settings which are favorable for the rise of plebiscitarian leaders, precisely because that was what Weber was thinking about, that basically you have to leave people passive, to make them rest without active communication with each other. So the main thing about the people is not to let them interfere with the political matters, with the matters of political responsibility. And then, of course, we have this taste for high-tech or digital solutions, which transfer into our hope for direct democracy. Once again, we are not talking here about countries like Russia and Hungary, but many countries which are thinking of what their democratic future would be. Next, please. And that in turn creates a demand for the strong leaders who would be capable of repressing those irresponsible representatives who are not actually accountable to the people, and the technocratic elites. And we can see this search for strong leaders in many countries. I think Germany is probably less prominent in that respect, but in many other countries in Europe, in America, both North America and South America, we have this tendency to look for strong leaders who would protect the people from the irresponsible elites. And the best way to select those leaders would be through plebiscitary elections. Yet another thing that I have to mention here is what Bernard Manin, the French philosopher, calls the audience democracy. Our democracy has transformed us into spectators, into passive audience, looking, staring even at those celebrities who are playing politics on our screens, and we can participate in this play with our approval or disapproval just by pushing a button. And that's what the political participation amounts to under this idea of the audience democracy. So if we don't really believe in the popular rule, what is left there? Well, what is left there is pressing a button and saying, well, I support that, I don't support that, I like that, I dislike that. Yeah, next, please. That's the final slide. I think what we have to think about today is what are the alternatives to this electoralization of democracy, which easily leads to the rise of plebiscitarian rule. Well, one way, of course, to think about it would be to reject democracy altogether. And now we have, I think, some theories that are suggesting precisely that. Democracy remains the hegemonic project. So basically, we have a consensus, I don't know, between very different rulers. I mean, Russia can Russian leaders can be in conflict with European leaders, but what they share is that democracy is the good regime. What they don't share is their vision of what democracy actually is, but they don't deny the importance of democracy. But now we already have some theories challenging this view and emphasizing a need for overcoming democracy, probably through some sort of artificial intelligence, epistocratic ruling. I wouldn't go into detail here. It's probably a different topic, but I think that this is interesting that this kind of crisis creates the idea of rejecting democracy altogether. Next, please. As of democratic alternatives, I think there are several of them debated right now. What you see here are probably the most prominent. we have this idea of sortition, which remember is the democratic institution as opposed to oligarchic elections according to the ancient Greeks, because sortition makes you the ruler and the ruled at once. They destroy the border between the ruler and the ruled. Everyone understands that he or she is simultaneously the ruler and the ruled. So bringing back sortition, and we have a lot of interesting experiments with sortition recently. It is sometimes combined with the idea of mini publics, of drawing people at random from the public, creating, generating those mini publics, and then making some decisions. Well, the question is, of course, who sets the agenda for those mini publics, and how do you integrate these elements of like direct democratic rule into representative framework? And yet another option, of course, yet another avenue is preventing those huge political entities from dominating the local matters, because the plebiscitarian tradition is, of course, based on the idea of the unitary people holding universal suffrage and electing only one leader. So basically, the more communities you have, and if they elect their elector, probably select through a lottery their own leaders, that would be already a split that would prevent the plebiscitarian rule from rising, and would actually encourage people to participate in politics. And then probably the final point is that here we have also a theoretical challenge, not only political challenge, but a theoretical challenge, because we have to rethink what democracy is. We have to rethink or probably escape this idea of democracy qua elections. We have to overcome this electoralized image of democracy. And it also means we have to rethink the people, so what the people is, other than a snapshot of the popular will, other than the numbers that we have after a vote or after a public opinion poll. So what actually the people is, if not the numbers. And of course, we have to reimagine democracy for the digital age, because those new technologies that I've mentioned in the very beginning are apparently inevitable. And if we don't want them to transform our democracy in a plebiscitarian way, we have to rethink how should we use them to enhance democracy rather than turning it into constant vote. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg, very much for this fascinating survey of the tradition, present, and possible future of plebiscitarian democracy. There are, of course, many things that one recognizes from contemporary political practice in the historical survey that you provided of the origins of the intellectual sources of plebiscitarian democracy. And I've also once again been convinced that Napoleon III is in many ways the founding figure of our political age. There are so many things that one really needs to understand Napoleon III for, if one wants to understand both the 20th and the 21st century. I would like to remind everyone that you can all post your questions or comments in the Q&A. I'm seeing that people have already started doing that. But I would like to kick off our discussion with a question of my own. So one of the things I find fascinating, and you mentioned this primarily for the contemporary US context, is that for all the limitations and the seemingly obvious deficits of this plebiscitarian conception of democracy, a lot of people seem to be extremely passionate about this idea of elections as the, almost kind of mystical centerpiece of our democratic polities. And I'm thinking, not only of systems such as the United States, where there's at least a comparatively equal political struggle between two opposing forces, but also countries such as Russia, where we have strong protest movements, which at least in part on the idea that we need to constitute or reconstitute a strong kind of electoral procedure. And there's a constant tension in such societies between people who mostly care about solving their own specific and local problems, and then on the other hand, protesters who are mostly about democracy and voting, etc., and who tend to almost dismiss the concerns of people who care about their local problems by saying, well, we need to reform the system first. We first need to have a robust system of democratic voting, and then we can attend to your kind of local parochial problems. So can you maybe speak a little bit more about that? Why is it that not only the political elites who clearly govern the system and benefit from the system, but also a lot of grassroots challengers seem to be so fixated on somehow fixing or reconstituting or renovating this plebiscitarian element in our democratic governance?
Yeah, that's a good question. Of course, they don't recognize it as a plebiscitarian element. What they do think is that, or the conception that they proceed from is that like redeeming elections amounts to redeeming democracy. And in countries like Russia or Hungary, for that case, I think the transition from the socialist or so-called socialist system in 80s and 90s, this transition was predicated on the idea of importing the democratic institutions from the so-called West, and among those institutions, these were liberal democratic institutions. But if we look more specifically at what are the institutions that managed to make it to those countries, well, we can see that generally we have free market there, with limitations perhaps, but there is a market economy. There is the idea of property rights. However bad they are protected, there's still this idea of property rights. And then there's this idea of elections, of holding an election. What we don't really have in countries like Russia, for instance, or Belarus, for the case, is the local democracy, the municipal democracy, the federalism. So my version of it would be that in those countries, this import of liberal democratic institutions resulted in importing rather liberal part of the equation and ignoring the democratic part of the equation. Just because the whole tradition that was standing behind this liberal democracy was not, I think, properly thought through at that point. And that was a kind of Trojan horse imported with this system.
But would you say that in itself can explain the force of passion with which a lot of people in recent years fight for this, liberal element of the democratic system?
Yeah, I honestly think that this actually a very uneasy mix of liberalism and democracy is not properly unpacked and people are fighting with this passion for a liberal element, believing it to be a democratic solution. And that's a kind of work that probably has to be done in those countries, but also, once again, also in many other countries, in the full scale liberal democracies, where we also see the similar tendency. I don't think there is a real difference in terms of direction between all those countries. Probably to some extent, Russia is just few steps ahead of many other countries on this plebiscitarian path, radicalizing the liberal part of the equation and downplaying the democratic part of the equation.
Right. Okay, that makes sense. So I will take one question from the Q&A. Abu Bakr Oruniki writes, what are the impacts of plebiscites on the education of youngsters, especially in the developing countries? As we can see in Africa, for example, there is no democracy.
I'm not sure I really understand about the education of youngsters.
I guess I would interpret that question as, how are young people being socialized into particular ways of behaving in democratic systems by the dominance in those systems of, plebiscitarian mechanisms?
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. I mean, as long as we have this this textbook definition of democracy as free and fair elections, that also, of course, informs the political socialization of the masses. And that's actually one thing that I think the contemporary political science in the US makes very clear, that people who understand democracy in that way, people who understand democracy as being equal to elections, well, what they are doing is that they are weighing their own chances. They're considering their own chances of influencing something through the elections. And since those chances are pretty small for the lower classes, or now even for the middle classes, they tend to be discouraged from political participation. So if democracy is about elections, then probably democracy doesn't worth my time. So that I think is the explanation for widespread depoliticization in many countries. I must confess I'm not an expert in Africa, but this at least is the way the political socialization works in many both Eastern and Western European countries, and also in the US. Yeah.
Right. So I actually have a follow-up question of my own on what you just said again about political science. I mean, one of the things that I really appreciated about your talk was that you showed how some of the normative preconceptions stemming from this theory of plebiscitarian democracy have really become kind of implied truths in a certain extremely widespread political science approach, right? And in all of the kind of global rankings of countries by strength of democracy that we all operate in, and that we're all constantly bombarded with through the media. And I mean, one of the developments in recent years in political science has been that, okay, we will no longer distinguish simply between democratic and authoritarian countries based on the idea that one set of countries has elections and the other does not. Instead, we will talk of hybrid regimes. And I think that what you presented to us really sort of gives us the tools to question that, because the idea of hybridity still presupposes that there are kind of these pure forms which are distinguished from each other by the presence or absence of elections. But I'm wondering if we abandon this kind of way of comparing countries based on, whether or not they have elections, whether or not there is kind of a level playing field. What other meaningful tools can we develop to compare different settings in terms of opportunities for democratic participation? Or do you think we should abandon this sort of comparative approach altogether?
Well, I actually think that you are right, that the whole idea of hybrid regimes is an offshoot of this democratization paradigm. And I mean, at some point, it just faced the problem of the regimes that were supposed to democratize, but not really willing to do so, and being stuck in an intermediate position. And that was interpreted as a kind of hybrid, as a kind of intermediate state, which seems to last. But that didn't imply abandoning the whole paradigm, because we still have this idea of hybrid regimes being predestined to evolve at some point into democracies, and just stuck there. But probably at some point, well, if we're lucky, they develop into those liberal democratic regimes. And that already implies some teleology, the teleology of democratization, meaning that liberal democracy is an inevitable end of the historical development. This I find really problematic. I don't see any ground for this kind of belief. Now that we have those very robust and stubborn regimes which combine two principles. So in that, I mean, there is a reason to call them perhaps hybrids, because they actually combine two very different principles. I think there is a difference between a synthesis and a hybrid. Hybrid being something imperfect, right? And synthesis being just as it was designed, because those plebiscitarian regimes, they really resemble what people like Weber were suggesting, and they were suggesting that as a robust type of rule. Probably not democratic. They didn't really believe in democracy, but they believed that they would be a robust type of rule. And so just going back to your question, I think in order to develop a framework for comparison, first thing we have to do is to abandon the teleology, because all those ratings, all those rankings, they are predicated on some teleology. So first of all, we have to get rid of this teleological thinking that drives us towards the idea of liberal democracy being an obvious solution to all problems. So it would rather be better to look at the varieties of democracy, because, well, obviously, to a certain extent, vast majority of the political systems that we observe now in the world are well, to a certain extent, democratic. I mean, they have a democratic element just precisely because the masses are already in the game. You cannot push them back. You cannot simply disenfranchise them. If you have the elections, you already have some sort of appeal to popular sovereignty, some sort of reference to popular sovereignty, and that means that there are many ways to integrate this appeal to popular sovereignty into the political settings. So my answer to this would be to differentiate between the varieties of democracy, between the element of real political participation in those regimes. We can obviously differentiate the regimes which are more favorable to political participation, to political engagement, and those who are less favorable to that. That, I think, would create a non-teleological and more objective view of how regimes or political systems differ in the way they use the idea of the people and of popular sovereignty.
Right. And I guess some of the more enlightened theorists of hybrid regimes would agree with you that we have to abandon teleology, but I do think that the important point of distinction here is that there's still this idea of hybridity as imperfection, as you were saying, whereas you're arguing that actually it's a completely viable type of system that actually has a logic of its own.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Okay, we have several more questions. I would like to take a comment from Martin Schad. who writes, "Dear Greg, many thanks for an inspiring talk. 2 points of interest. First, the Weimar experience. Max Weber and Carl Schmitt aside, the reality of plebiscites in the Weimar Republic was abysmal. Nothing worked, neither the repossession of aristocratic property, neither the Panzerkreuzerverbot, nor even the reactionary rejection of the Young Plan. Theory beaten by reality. Second point, I'd be grateful if you could say a little more about accountability when it comes to sortition or randomly chosen mini publics. A very German question, rooted in a belief in rule-bound legality challengeable in courts."
Yeah, thank you, Martin. Good questions. Well, actually, when I'm talking about the plebiscitarian rule in the Weimar Republic, I'm not really referring to the actual plebiscites, but the plebiscitarian meaning of the elections, because the elections during the Weimar Republic, that was to a large extent, so to say, a prototype for a plebiscitarian procedure. Because in both cases, when Hindenburg was elected, it was elected as someone who would stand above the system and use all those powers to put a stop to the ongoing crisis. And of course, we know that Hindenburg was largely elected by people who were pretty much distrustful of the Republic. So it was a monarchic element in the Republic. And then, of course, you have this idea of plebiscites working already under the National Socialist Party, which created legitimacy through that. The actual political significance of plebiscites is not in solving some sort of problem, some sort of political issue, but rather in creating a democratic legitimacy for the leader through the acclamation. So the leader is the one who benefits the vote, no matter what is the outcome of the political technicalities. So that's the answer to the first question. Now, the second question is, of course, very good, about accountability in those randomly chosen mini publics. This is a topic that is currently discussed in political theory, and obviously we cannot expect here an accountability in the traditional sense, in the sense in which we think of our representatives being accountable to us just because we elect them. The usual idea is that, well, if they are not following, if they're not represent us properly, then we wouldn't re-elect them, and that's the threat that we are supposed to have. Well, the actual research shows that this kind of threat doesn't really work. Because when people come to the polling stations, they normally wouldn't evaluate the work of their representatives, but rather listen to their promises for the new term. And that actually demolishes the whole idea of this kind of accountability or responsibility. So this is just a background to, or rather reference point to compare those mini publics with. Obviously, those mini publics, if they are selected randomly from ordinary citizens, they are not really interested in being re-elected. So this kind of accountability doesn't work either. But what actually works, perhaps, is something that we can perhaps inherit from the ancient Greeks. The idea that the people who are representing us on those boards, they are obliged to to make so to say a report, or to present the results of their action before an audience after the end of their term, and then perhaps being judged by their cohabitants as good or bad, not exactly representatives, but as good or bad citizens. So basically what we have here is the idea of sanctioning them through those retrospective reports. But I have to admit that there might be an issue here. A hope here is that normally when those experiments are conducted, people are really or at least a portion of those people who represent the constituencies in those publics, they tend to get engaged into this kind of deliberation, just because this is the first time in their life that they feel that something really depends on them. So they tend to do their best. Not necessarily would be the best solution, but they tend to invest their effort into this kind of political participation.
If I may jump in here again very quickly, we had a talk in this series a few months ago by Veikko Eranti from Finland, who is studying what he calls total democracy in Finland, based on the observation that in Finnish society, basically every decision is subjected to democratic deliberation by some social institution, be it your local co-op board or part of even supermarket chains have democratic governance, the churches, etc. And one of his remarks was that in those kinds of systems, democratic decision making tends to be hijacked by the most active and the most connected people, even though theoretically everyone has the same opportunity to participate. So isn't that a serious challenge to these kinds of solutions, that just as with jury duty or other kind of random selection procedures, the most active, the most involved people who have maybe the most free time on their hands also tend to kind of hijack and monopolize this process?
Well, I think there are two sides to that. One of them is, of course, that those who are privileged might benefit from the status, as, for instance, with having extra time to be engaged. That probably creates some problem, but the chance of those people being dominant on the board is not very high. Particularly in present-day unequal societies. As for the uneven distribution of engagement among those members, I don't see it as much a problem, actually, because that was what you're describing actually pretty much reflects the ancient experience, the Athenian experience. Because obviously among all those citizens present at the assembly, not all of them actually use their opportunity to speak up and to make a real contribution. Of course, they have the political leaders. The most important thing is not this substantive equality of contribution, but rather the political equality of participation, so that everyone feels participating in making this decision. This is what makes the decisions legitimate. This is what makes us feel that we are part of this decision. Even if I choose to abstain from making long comments, or even if I choose to abstain from making long speeches, at least I have this understanding that I was part of the decision-making process. And that already creates a feeling of legitimacy. But yeah, once again, I think that what we know about those deliberative experiments is that people who usually tend to ignore politics altogether because they don't believe in their contribution. Once they have this this chance of contributing to something, well, they feel more enthusiastic and more willing to participate, even if there will be still some bias towards the most educated, the most prepared.
Well, that's certainly an optimistic outlook. We have an anonymous question in the Q&A. Representative democracy was advocated for in order to prevent the political system from quick changes of popular opinion. What do you think about continuity as a major requirement for democracy to function?
Well, that's a good question. Actually, representative democracy was initially created because of not because of the possible changes in public opinion, but rather because of the fear of the majority, that the opinion might be consistent but might be repressive towards the minorities. So that was the origin of representative democracy in American case, for instance. As for the continuity in public sentiment, I think too much continuity might be actually a problem. None other than Thomas Jefferson, just going back to the American case, none other than Thomas Jefferson even suggested having a civil war or a revolution every 25 years. It was pretty close to that. Why so? Well, because every 25 years we have a new generation. And why would this new generation, why would these new people automatically become part of the previous people, creating this artificial continuity? This, I think, is an interesting idea, given the problems that we have now with the change of the elites in many countries, such as the US, Russia, probably even Germany to some extent. So probably we need more discontinuity in the country. Probably we have to experiment more, because now that we cherish this continuity, we probably are going astray because of that.
So maybe, since I'm not seeing any more questions in the Q&A, this brings me to a final question about your own preferences or solutions. So you've outlined several models that are being debated in democratic theory, and I think you've indicated, at least cautiously, some of your sympathies. But I'm wondering what you think are the most promising models, and also what you would do to persuade the many advocates of more kind of direct, now seeing, certainly all over countries, that they should try out other solutions to democratic deficit.
Well, what I really believe in is that we have to face the issue of disengagement, of the distrust. So any viable solution should target this particular issue. We have to think of how to bring the people back. In that sense, and yet another comment. Even though I'm criticizing now voting and elections, I don't really see voting and elections disappear from current political regimes. That's simply not possible. They can be part of more democratic design. We just have to rethink how we use them. So basically, the danger here, the danger that I'm pointing at, is reducing democracy to elections. When we have this idea that democracy is just making a snapshot of the popular will, this is really dangerous. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we have to get rid of the elections. The most important thing is in the elections is actually not the vote itself, the moment of the vote, but rather what happens before the vote, during the vote, and after the vote. So the campaigning, the debates, all the political quarreling, the movements, counting the ballots and then disputing the results, those are parts of the democratic process. That's why I think this move towards e-democracy might be really dangerous, because it tends to operate on the assumption that democracy is about just counting the vote. And since we have those technical opportunities to count it immediately, well, that would be an ideal democracy. That's not the way it works. So I think that even keeping the elections, we have to think of how to engage people in those other elements of the system. In that sense, I think that we, I really appreciate what some of the people who call themselves populists are doing. Because what they are doing is that they are bringing real conflict inside the political domain. Sometimes it looks, of course, it looks not really well polite. Sometimes it may create some distaste, but it also brings back the feeling that there's something really important debated in the political field. Well, look at what's happening now in the U.S. Sometimes some people would say that the American democracy is experiencing a crisis. That's probably true, but I'm not sure that I would agree that the fact that there is this kind of political participation is a sign of the crisis. It's rather a sign of the effectiveness of American democracy. At least the president, who was despised by so many opponents, he managed to bring a lot of people back to the polling stations in 2020, voting both for him and against him. So people are kind of back to politics. So my answer to this general question would be that we have to experiment with many options and many formats, encouraging people to participate more. But even in speaking of elections, we have to bring back this feeling that there's something important being decided at these elections, and that people have their say at these elections, not only by pressing the button and giving a vote, but also by participating in what surrounds the election.
Well, that is an appropriately complex and constructive closing statement. Thank you very much, Greg Yudin, for taking the time to talk to us tonight. Thanks everyone also for listening. And I would like to close by reminding you that our next discussion, a discussion that I think will actually echo some of the themes that we touched upon today, will take place tomorrow night, when the Swiss sociologist Luca Pataroni will present his collaborative work on what he calls choreopolitics, or a politics of rhythm, and will discuss it in conversation with the sociologist and social theorist Hartmut Rosa. So I'm hoping to be able to welcome many of you back to the online Einstein Forum tomorrow night. In the meantime, have a good night, and thanks again, Greg. And I hope
thank you so much
again in person at the Einstein Forum when the pandemic.
It was a pleasure to be with you. Yeah, also hope to meet you in person.
Right.
Have a good evening.